when my parents stepped onto my porch with a notarized folder. They looked like people collecting a debt. My brother stood in the driveway, spinning his keys, smiling like the house was already his. None of the three understood that the signature I was about to give them would not be a surrender. It would unlock the most expensive secret our family had hidden for years. My name is Rachel Wakefield. I am 37 years old. Noah Mercer and I had been married for exactly 13 days. We had not even finished unpacking the wedding gifts in the spare bedroom of the bungalow I owned in Briar Glen, North Carolina. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of the pine trees that lined my backyard. And the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Noah was leaning against the kitchen counter, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the morning news on mute. It was a picture of absolute, hard-earned peace. Then came the sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. When I opened it, the peace shattered instantly, replaced by the suffocating weight of family duty. My parents, Martin and Helena Wakefield, stood on my porch. My father wore his usual pressed slacks and a golf shirt, his jaw set in that tight, uncompromising line that meant he had already made a decision for everyone else. My mother stood slightly behind him, clutching a pink bakery box as if it were a shield. Flanking them was my younger brother, Brett. He was 29, but carried himself with the restless, unearned confidence of a teenager who knew he would never face detention. Standing slightly apart from the three of them was a woman I had never seen before. She wore a stiff gray blazer and clutched a heavy leather briefcase to her chest. She looked profoundly uncomfortable, her eyes darting from my face to my father's shoulder. "We are coming in," Martin said. It was not a request. He stepped past me, bringing the cold morning air with him. Helena scurried in right behind, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floors I had spent 3 years saving up to refinish. Brett slouched through the doorway, not bothering to wipe his shoes on the mat, his eyes immediately drifting upward to examine the crown molding. The stranger in the blazer hesitated, offering me a tight, apologetic grimace before stepping inside. "Good morning, sweetheart," Helena said, her voice pitched an octave higher than normal. She placed the bakery box on my kitchen island, right next to Noah, who had not moved an inch. "I brought those lemon pastries you used to like when you were in high school. We thought we would drop by." Noah looked at the box, then looked at me. His expression did not change, but the stillness in his shoulders told me he was already bracing for impact. Noah was an independent electrician. He worked with live wires for a living. He knew exactly what it looked like when a circuit was about to blow. "You did not drive an hour just to bring pastries on a Tuesday." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. I closed the front door. "Who is she?" I gestured toward the woman in the blazer. Martin did not hesitate. He walked over to my solid oak dining table, pulled a thick, legal-sized folder from his leather portfolio, and slapped it down. The sound echoed in the small dining room like a gunshot. "This is Brenda," my father said, tapping his index finger against the top of the folder. "She is a notary public. I brought her along to save us all some time." I stared at the folder. I knew exactly what a notary was for, and I knew what my father wanted. He wanted the house, my house, the one I bought with 11 years of overtime. Skipped vacations, packed lunches, and ignored exhaustion. "Brett just needs the house for a few months," Helena blurted out. Her hands fluttered nervously in front of her chest. She could not meet my gaze. "Just to get his feet under him. Rachel, he has a brilliant new startup idea, a design studio. He needs a respectable address to register the business and impress the initial investors. You know how hard it has been for him since that landscaping thing fell through. He just needs a solid foundation. We will figure everything out later." "A few months," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. "It makes the most sense," Martin interjected, stepping in front of my mother to take control of the narrative. He leaned heavily on the back of one of my dining chairs. "You and Noah just got married. You have 2 incomes now. You can easily rent an apartment in town for a year or two while Brett gets this off the ground. You are the strongest in this family. Rachel. You always have been. You can carry this. You are the strongest in this family. You can carry this. It was the anthem of my entire existence. It was the excuse they used when they drained my college savings to bail Brett out of a car loan. It was the justification they offered when they missed my graduation to attend his court hearing for reckless driving. My strength was never a point of pride for them. It was simply a utility. It meant they could throw all their weight onto my shoulders and never have to worry about me breaking. I turned my head to look at Brett. He was not paying attention to the conversation determining his future. He was wandering through my living room, running his fingers along the drywall. He paused by the fireplace, tilting his head as if measuring the space. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was already planning to rip out the original tile. He was picking out the shade of charcoal paint he would use to cover the vintage brick. He looked thrilled. He looked like a man who had just won a lottery he did not even buy a ticket for. Usually. This was the exact moment the fire would ignite inside my chest. In any previous year, I would have yelled. I would have pointed at the door. I would have listed the thousands of hours I worked, the holidays I spent sitting in a cubicle, the sheer financial terror I survived to put my name on this deed. I would have fought them tooth and nail, begging them to see me, begging them to value me just a fraction of the amount they valued the son who bled them dry. But as I stood there, looking at my father's demanding glare, my mother's cowardly pleading, and my brother's greedy anticipation, I felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. In their place was a cold, crystalline clarity. I walked slowly toward the dining table. The notary, Brenda, shrank back slightly as I approached. I looked down at the documents. It was a standard deed transfer. The paperwork was immaculate, drawn up by someone who knew exactly how to strip a person of their property efficiently. Noah stepped out from the kitchen. He did not say a word, but he moved to stand directly behind my right shoulder. His presence was a solid, undeniable force. He was my witness. I looked up from the papers and locked eyes with my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single tremor of emotion bleed into my tone. "If I sign today," I said, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the room, "from now on, you will never use my life to fix Brett's mistakes again, right?" The room froze. The silence was so complete I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Helena stopped fidgeting with her sweater. Brett stopped dead in his tracks, his hand hovering inches from my fireplace mantel. Even Brenda, the notary, seemed to stop breathing. They were waiting for a fight. They had come armed for a screaming match. They had no idea what to do with a surrender. "Right," Martin snapped instantly. His eyes flashed with a greedy, desperate victory. He answered so fast he did not even bother to consider the weight of the promise. He just wanted the signature. He just wanted the asset. Noah shifted his weight behind me. He did not speak, but I knew he had carved that single word into his memory. Right. I reached into the holder in the center of the table and pulled out a heavy black pen. "I will sign," I said smoothly. I pulled the chair out and sat down. "But I want every single page initialed by all parties, not just the signature line, every page. And I want a fully notarized copy placed in my hands before anyone walks out of that front door." Brenda scrambled forward, relieved to finally have a job to do. "Yes, of course, ma'am. I have the stamp and the copies right here." Martin let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "Always have to make it difficult. Rachel, fine. Do what she says. Brenda, let us get this over with." I uncapped the pen. I pressed the tip to the heavy parchment paper. I signed my name on the first line. Perfectly legible, perfectly steady. I flipped the page and signed the next. I did not hesitate. I did not look back at my mother, who was now quietly wiping a tear from her eye, playing the role of the relieved peacemaker. I did not look at Brett, who was practically vibrating with excitement. As I handed the final page to Brenda to apply her heavy seal, I looked up at the window reflecting the morning sun. I let a small, tight smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was a smile so profoundly calm, so entirely devoid of defeat, that I felt Noah's hand rest gently on my shoulder. Noah understood me. He looked at my face, and he looked at the wet ink on the documents. He knew I was not giving up my home. He knew I was laying a trap. This was not a surrender. This was the moment I opened fire. I spend 40 hours a week managing contracts at Larkstone Title and Escrow. My desk is a graveyard of broken dreams and bad investments. I read through clauses, subclauses, and addendums that can strip a family of their generational wealth with a single misplaced initial. I know the anatomy of a deed. I know the legal weight of a quitclaim. Most importantly, I know that when you sign your name on the dotted line, you are not just giving away wood and drywall, you are legally transferring power. My parents believed they were pulling a fast one on a naive daughter who simply folded under family pressure. They forgot what I do for a living. That 2-bedroom bungalow was not a gift, and it certainly was not an inheritance. It was the physical manifestation of 11 years of my blood, sweat, and absolute denial. While my peers in their 20s were taking weekend trips to Nashville or booking flights to Cabo, I was picking up weekend shifts. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that rattled when it hit 60 miles per hour. I wore winter coats until the lining frayed. I skipped the Friday night dinners, the expensive lattes, the upgraded phones. I lived on generic brand pasta and sheer willpower to save the 20% down payment. I wanted one thing in this world that could not be taken away, repossessed, or used as collateral for someone else. I wanted a sanctuary. Noah understood that about me long before he put a ring on my finger. Noah is a man who builds things to last. As an independent electrician, he spends his days pulling wires through dark crawl spaces and fixing the dangerous, hidden mistakes left behind by careless contractors. He is practical. He does not wear flashy clothes or talk loudly in crowded rooms. He looks at a foundation and knows exactly where the stress fractures will form. He knew the stress fractures in my family long before I ever admitted them out loud. My brother, Brett, was the walking embodiment of a structural failure. To my parents, Brett was not a son. He was a lifelong renovation project they refused to abandon. When he dropped out of his state university after 3 semesters, claiming the professors lacked vision, my father patted him on the back and called him an entrepreneur. When Brett totaled his car because he was texting on the highway, my parents bought him a pre-owned truck 4 days later because he could not possibly take the bus. When his craft brewery venture collapsed, leaving a mountain of debt, my mother called it a learning phase. But the rules were entirely different for me. When I needed money for college tuition, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and delivered a stern lecture about the value of a hard-earned dollar. They called me the independent one. It was a convenient title. It meant they did not have to pay attention to me. It meant every spare cent, every ounce of emotional support, and every safety net was exclusively reserved for Brett. I accepted this dynamic for decades. I built a wall around my life and expected them to stay on their side. But the wall had already been breached. The first crack appeared 6 months before Noah and I got married. We were sitting at my dining table one evening, mapping out the catering budget, when an alert popped up on my phone from my credit monitoring app. It was a notification for a hard credit inquiry. A bank I had never done business with was running a background check on my social security number for a substantial commercial loan. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. I immediately logged into the bureau portals. I placed a hard freeze on my entire profile. Then, instead of calling my parents and asking questions I knew they would lie about, I called Lena Voss. Lena is an attorney who handles the messy, contested estates that come through Larkstone. She is ruthless, brilliant, and possesses a terrifying ability to track down financial ghosts. I paid her retainer from my wedding savings and asked her to dig quietly. It took her 3 weeks to find the paper trail. We met at a corner diner downtown, far away from my office. Lena slid a manila folder across the sticky table. her expression grim. Inside the folder were photocopies of a commercial equipment lease from 4 years prior. It was for heavy-duty riding mowers, trailers, and chainsaws. It was the exact equipment Brett had used for his short-lived premium landscaping business. The business had failed miserably, leaving thousands of dollars in unpaid vendor invoices. I looked at the guarantor page. The name listed was Rachel Wakefield. The social security number was mine. The birth date was mine. But the address was an old apartment building I had moved out of years ago, and the signature was a clumsy, looping imitation of my handwriting. "It is a crude forgery," Lena had said, tapping her manicured fingernail against the false signature. But the lender did not do their due diligence, and the debt was eventually written off and sold to a junk buyer. "It is sitting in a dormant file. But the recent inquiry, that means someone is trying to use your clean slate again. They are testing the waters." I sat in that diner booth, staring at the fraudulent ink, and felt the last thread of my familial loyalty snap. I knew it was not just Brett. Brett was lazy and entitled, but he lacked the organizational focus to pull off identity theft on a corporate scale. Martin Wakefield, however, spent his entire career in commercial supply chains. My father knew exactly how to structure a lease, how to bypass a secondary check, and how to use a shadow guarantor. My father had stolen my financial identity to buy my brother a fleet of lawnmowers, and when it failed, he had just let the wreckage sink into the mud, hoping it would never surface. A normal person would have driven straight to their parents' house and thrown the front door open. A normal person would have screamed, cried, and demanded answers. But working in real estate law teaches you one very important lesson: you never confront a liar with a piece of a puzzle. You let them build the entire picture themselves, and then you lock them inside it. Men like my father thrive in the gray areas. If I had confronted him with Lena's blurry photocopies, he would have gaslighted me. He would have claimed it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding, or a desperate mistake made with pure intentions. He would have rallied my mother to cry and beg for forgiveness, turning me into the villain for trying to destroy the family over old money. He would never show his true face until he was absolutely certain he had won. I needed him to feel invincible. I needed him to step completely out of the shadows and commit to a fraud so massive, so undeniable, and so heavily documented that no amount of smooth talking could save him. So, I stayed silent. I unfroze my credit just enough to let the traps remain open, but set up alerts on every single database Lena could monitor. I went on planning my wedding. I smiled at family dinners. I listened to my father give a toast at my reception about the importance of family trust. I knew the storm was coming. I just did not know what form it would take until that Tuesday morning when they walked onto my porch with the notary. When Martin slapped that deed transfer onto my dining table. I was not shocked. I was not heartbroken. I was relieved. The waiting was over. The years of quiet resentment, the decades of being the forgotten workhorse, and the sickening discovery of my stolen identity had all culminated in this one perfectly packaged moment. They were arrogant enough to believe I would sign away my biggest asset out of sheer habit. They were so used to using me to pave over Brett's potholes that they did not even consider the possibility that the pavement might finally crack open and swallow them whole. That is why I signed the papers so quickly. That is why I demanded every page be initialed. I was not giving them a house. I was handing them a loaded weapon, pointing the barrel squarely at their own chests, and politely waiting for them to pull the trigger. The moment the deadbolt slid into place, sealing the front door behind my parents and brother, the air in the living room shifted. There was no dramatic collapse on my part. I did not slide down the wall and weep into my hands. I did not scream into a throw pillow. Instead, I turned to my husband. Noah was already watching me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his denim work pants. We did not need to exchange a grand, emotional speech. We had discussed the skeletal framework of this exact scenario in hushed tones over the past few weeks, treating it like a hypothetical fire drill. Now, the alarm was ringing. Start with the bedroom, I told him, my voice steady, clipped, and entirely devoid of the panic my family surely expected me to be drowning in. Only what we can fit in the back of your work van and my trunk. Nothing bolted to the walls. Nothing that legally constitutes a fixture. Noah gave a single, curt nod. He understood the assignment. We moved through the house with the synchronized precision of a tactical team clearing a building. It was not a frantic escape, it was a surgical extraction. I had spent years pouring my soul into the foundation of this property. But in that moment, I detached from it completely. It was no longer my sanctuary. It was a stage I was resetting for the next act. I walked into my home office and pulled a stack of heavy-duty cardboard boxes from the closet. I started with the filing cabinets, every single piece of paper bearing my name. Every tax return, every pay stub, every medical record went into a reinforced bin. I left no trace of my identity behind. I did not want my father rummaging through my past, looking for loose threads to pull. While Noah dismantled the custom oak bed frame he had built for us before the wedding, I moved to the kitchen. I packed my grandmother's china, the good silverware, and the espresso machine. I left the refrigerator stocked with the basics. I left the curtains hanging perfectly straight. I even wiped down the granite countertops with a lemon-scented cleaner until they gleamed. Noah walked in carrying a heavy box of books. He paused, watching me meticulously align the salt and pepper shakers next to the stove. "You are leaving it too perfect," Noah said softly, setting the box down by the back door. He leaned against the doorframe, his dark eyes analyzing my movements. People who get bullied out of their homes usually break a plate or take the light bulbs. You are leaving them a pristine, move-in ready showroom. It is suspicious. "Let them be suspicious," I replied, tossing the cleaning rag into the sink. My father expects me to be angry. He expects me to be petty. If I break a window or take the appliances, I give him a reason to play the victim. I give him a reason to call me unstable. I will not give him a single inch of moral high ground. I am leaving this house exactly the way the contract dictates, empty of my personal belongings, but structurally flawless. Noah smirked, a small, knowing expression that made me love him even more. He did not ask any more questions. He just picked up the box and carried it out to the van. Once the vehicles were loaded, I sat down at the small kitchen island with my laptop. The digital dismantling was just as crucial as the physical one. I opened a dozen tabs. Within 45 minutes, I had systematically severed every tie connecting my name to the property. I logged into the utility portals and scheduled shutoffs for the end of the billing cycle. I canceled the high-speed internet. I rerouted my mail to a secure post office box. I went into my banking app and canceled every single automatic payment associated with the property address. I wanted the financial cord cut clean and fast. Finally, I pulled the freshly notarized deed transfer from my bag. I opened my scanner app and captured every single page, paying special attention to the initials on the bottom margins. I attached the digital document to a secure email addressed to Helena Voss. The subject line was simple: "The bait is in the water." I hit send. I shut the laptop. It was done. I did not leave a note on the counter. There was no tearful goodbye letter, no final list of grievances, no dramatic warning to my brother about respecting the hardwood floors. A letter would imply I still cared about their validation. Silence was far more lethal. They wanted a ghost, so I gave them one. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the house was entirely empty of us. We locked the back door, walked out to the driveway, and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror, while my brother was undoubtedly sitting in a local bar, bragging to his friends about how his stubborn sister finally saw reason and handed over the keys. Noah and I were navigating the winding back roads toward Fairwick. Fairwick was the next town over, a quiet, sleepy municipality where the houses were spaced far apart and people minded their own business. We pulled up to a secluded carriage house hidden behind a dense line of weeping willows. It belonged to an older gentleman Noah occasionally did electrical work for, a man who valued cash payments and absolute discretion. The space was small, essentially a studio apartment perched above a detached garage. But it was clean, warm, and entirely off the radar of anyone in my family. We spent the evening unpacking the essentials. We ate takeout noodles sitting cross-legged on the floor because we had not bothered to bring a dining table. The silence of the carriage house was different from the silence of my old home. It was not heavy with the anticipation of a fight. It was the silence of a bunker before the artillery begins to fire. Later that night, long after the streetlights had flickered on, we lay on the mattress we had pushed into the corner of the room. The shadows of the willow branches danced across the ceiling. I was staring up at the plaster, my mind mapping out the next legal maneuvers, when Noah reached out and rested his hand over mine. "Are you scared you went too far today?" Noah asked quietly in the dark. His voice held no judgment, only a deep protective curiosity. "Signing away the title, moving into a garage. It is a massive gamble. Rachel?" I turned my head to look at him. His silhouette was comforting, a solid anchor in a sea of calculated chaos. "I did not go too far," I whispered, squeezing his fingers. "I have spent my entire life standing exactly where they told me to stand. I was the load-bearing wall holding up their delusions. Today, I did not go too far. I simply stepped out of the way. I stopped standing where they were used to seeing me. Now, we get to watch the roof collapse on their heads." Noah exhaled a long breath, pulling me slightly closer. "All right then, we watch it fall." The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The air in the carriage house was chilly. I pulled on a thick wool sweater, brewed a pot of cheap coffee, and sat by the single window overlooking the gravel driveway. I picked up my phone. It did not take long to find exactly what I was looking for. I opened my social media applications. My brother's profile was public, a monument to his unearned vanity. Right at the top of his feed was a brand new photograph. It was a picture of Brett standing on the front porch of my bungalow. He was leaning against the wooden railing, holding a mug of coffee, staring off into the distance like a visionary entrepreneur. The morning light caught the smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. He had even used a filter to make the brickwork look warmer. The caption beneath the photo read, "Huge moves happening. Proud to announce the new headquarters for the studio. A fresh start and a new beginning. Big things coming soon." I stared at the screen. He could not resist. He could not simply take the house and keep his mouth shut. His ego required an audience. He needed everyone to know he had acquired prime real estate. He thought he was announcing a victory. He had no idea he was publicly documenting his legal control over an asset at the exact moment I needed proof of his possession. He had just handed me a time-stamped, geographically tagged piece of evidence that he was holding himself out as the rightful owner. I pressed the buttons on the side of my phone and took a screenshot. I saved the image to a secure folder. Then, I took another screenshot, just to be safe. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid burned the back of my throat in the best possible way. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety that permanently lived at the base of my neck began to loosen. The anger that had fueled my 20s, the resentment that had clouded my 30s, it all evaporated into the cold morning air. I looked at the screenshot one last time. I felt remarkably, terrifyingly calm. The pieces were officially on the board, and my family had just made their first fatal move. Brett did not merely move into the bungalow, he staged an occupation. Within the first 48 hours of possessing the keys, he treated the property not as a home to be respected, but as a blank canvas for his unearned vanity. He immediately changed the locks. A deeply insulting and entirely unnecessary gesture considering Noah and I had voluntarily handed over every copy. By the end of the first week, Brett was hosting vision meetings in the living room. He brought in 2 small-time local investors, men who wore expensive watches, but lacked basic business acumen, and served them imported beer on the back patio. He paced back and forth across the lawn, waving his arms, loudly describing the high-end design and renovation studio he was going to build. He pointed to my perfectly good, structurally sound kitchen window and talked about smashing it out to create an open concept flow. He was playing the role of the visionary founder, using my equity as his stage dressing. My mother, Helena, was his eager accomplice in this delusion. 3 days after the forced signing, she arrived at the house with a trunk full of custom-ordered silk curtains. She spent an entire afternoon taking down the minimalist linen blinds I had painstakingly researched and saved for, replacing them with heavy, ostentatious fabrics that did not fit the character of the bungalow at all. She brought over a contractor to measure the kitchen island for a marble upgrade. The entire family moved through my former rooms with a sickeningly buoyant energy. They acted as though the universe had simply recognized Brett's latent genius and righted a temporary cosmic imbalance. The house finally belonged to the golden child. Order, in their minds, was beautifully restored. Martin, meanwhile, took on the role of Chief Public Relations Officer. My father was a man who understood that a stolen asset is only secure if the community agrees it was a gift. He worked the family grapevine with masterful precision. Over Sunday dinners and long phone calls with my aunts, uncles, and his church acquaintances, he spun a beautiful, tragic tale of familial devotion. According to Martin's narrative, I had not been cornered on a Tuesday morning with a prearranged notary. Instead, he claimed I had experienced a sudden, heartwarming realization about the importance of blood ties as a newlywed. I had voluntarily, even joyfully, surrendered the property to give my struggling brother a leg up. "Rachel always knows what matters," Martin told my aunt. A conversation I heard about through a mutual friend. "She knows family is more important than property. She just wanted to see her brother thrive." It was a brilliant, preemptive strike. He was locking me into the role of the saintly sister. If I ever tried to complain or fight back, I would look like a bitter, unstable liar trying to revoke a generous wedding gesture. But beneath my father's smug, country club satisfaction, there was a frantic, vibrating current of anxiety that he could not entirely hide. I knew this because Brett, unable to keep anything quiet, was constantly complaining on his social media about the annoying paperwork of business expansion. Brett was not just living in the house rent-free, he was immediately leveraging it. Following Martin's strict instructions, Brett contacted Hawthorne Bridge Lending, a boutique private finance firm known for aggressively funding speculative commercial real estate ventures. Brett applied for a massive bridge loan, ostensibly to fund the grand renovation of his design studio. Hawthorne Bridge Lending was not a traditional bank. They charged exorbitant interest rates and required ironclad collateral. But they moved fast. Their underwriter demanded a standard commercial package before they would wire a single dollar, a recorded transfer deed, a sworn affidavit of ownership, and a clean, fully updated title report. Normally, a borrower takes their time gathering these documents, allowing the legal process to breathe. But Martin was pushing Brett relentlessly, through mutual acquaintances in town. I heard that Martin was calling Brett 4 times a day, demanding updates on the underwriting portal. My father needed that cash injection much faster than his calm exterior suggested. The bridge loan was not for Brett's business. It was a desperate lifeline for Martin. While they scrambled to monetize my life's work, I maintained a routine of absolute, disciplined normalcy. Noah and I lived quietly in the small carriage house in Fairwick. Our temporary home lacked a proper oven, and the water pressure was terrible, but it felt remarkably light. Every morning, I woke up at 6, drank coffee from a cheap plastic machine, and drove 30 minutes to the Larkstone Title and Escrow office. I wore my usual neat slacks and blazers. I reviewed contracts, flagged missing signatures, and ate my packed lunches in the break room. I played the part of the wounded, accommodating daughter flawlessly. When my mother sent a tentative text message asking if she could throw away a box of old gardening shears I had left in the shed, I replied within 5 minutes, politely telling her to do whatever she thought was best. I gave them absolutely no resistance. I let them feel entirely, dangerously secure. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after I moved out, I left the Larkstone office an hour early and walked 3 blocks to Lena Voss's private practice. Lena's office smelled of old legal volumes, strong espresso, and impending litigation. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from her massive oak desk and watched her read through the final, county-recorded copy of the notarized deed. Lena did not rush. She read every single page, tracing the margins with the gold tip of her fountain pen. She checked the notary seal. She verified the county clerk's filing stamp. When she finally looked up, her sharp, dark eyes were gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. "They actually filed it," Lena said, leaning back in her chair and placing the document precisely in the center of her desk. "They recorded the transfer the very next morning. They did not even wait a full 24 hours to make it public." "My father is a man of action when he believes he has secured a free asset," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "He needs the capital from Hawthorne Bridge Lending. He is writing Brett to push the bridge loan through underwriting before the end of the month." Lena tapped her pen against the mahogany surface. "Now they have put themselves exactly where you need them." I looked at the deed on her desk, the physical proof of their greed. "Not quite yet," I corrected her softly. Lena raised an elegant eyebrow. "You have the recorded deed. We have the proof of coercion from your wedding timeline. We have the suspicious credit inquiries from 6 months ago. We could drop the hammer tomorrow. Rachel, I could file an injunction, freeze the property, and tie them up in civil court for the next 3 years." I shook my head. "If we freeze the property right now, my father will spin it. He will claim he was just trying to help Brett secure a small business line of credit. He will say it was a family misunderstanding about temporary living arrangement. He will find a way to minimize his intent. I do not want his actions minimized. I want him fully, undeniably exposed." I stood up and walked over to the tall window, looking down at the gray, rain-slicked streets of the business district. I thought about my mother hanging those hideous silk drapes in my living room, trying to overwrite my existence. I thought about my brother playing the successful entrepreneur on my patio, drinking beer bought with my equity. Most of all, I thought about my father, confidently telling our relatives that I'd joyfully sacrificed my own stability to feed his son's bottomless ego. "I want them to go all the way," I said, turning back to face my lawyer. "I want Brett to submit the final loan application. I want Hawthorne Bridge Lending to officially pull the title report. I want my father to be days away from his payout, completely reliant on that specific money, before the floor drops out from under him. We do not strike until they try to cash the check." Lena smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that told me she entirely approved of the cruelty of my patience. She closed the manila folder with a decisive snap. "We wait for the title report, then." Lena agreed. The trap was fully set. The bait had been swallowed whole. My arrogant, unsuspecting family was already cheering for their own victory, celebrating a finish line they had not actually crossed. They thought I was a defeated woman nursing her wounds in a cramped apartment. They had absolutely no idea I was simply waiting for them to make one more stupid, irreversible move. The notification arrived in Brett's inbox on a Tuesday afternoon. Hawthorne Bridge Lending sent a standard automated message. But the attached document was the executioner's block. It was the preliminary title report. A title report is the absolute, undeniable truth of real estate. It does not care about family dynamics, manipulative fathers, or golden child syndromes. It only cares about recorded facts. Brett, expecting a pristine document showing him as the sole, unencumbered owner of a highly valuable asset, opened the file while sitting in my former kitchen. He was likely already spending the bridge loan money in his head. Instead, he hit a reinforced brick wall of legal reality. The house was not clean. It had never been clean. Lurking in the public records, filed neatly and legally binding in the county archives, was a senior lien. It was a private mortgage, properly recorded against the property from the exact day I closed on it years ago. The lien holder was not a traditional bank whose automated customer service systems could perhaps be bypassed or stalled with endless phone calls. It was the June Ellison Family Trust. June was my mother's older sister, a fiercely pragmatic woman who had passed away a decade ago. Before she died, knowing exactly what kind of financial parasites my parents could be. Aunt June had set up a heavily restricted trust. It was designed to help me, and only me, establish a secure foothold in the world. When I bought the bungalow, I had saved relentlessly, but the market was brutal. The trust provided the final 20% down payment in the form of a private loan. Aunt June's trustee, a merciless and detail-oriented estate lawyer named Harold, drafted the terms of that loan. The document included a standard, ironclad due-on sale clause, which we in the title business call an acceleration provision. The language was exceptionally clear. It dictated that if the title of the property was ever transferred, sold, or reassigned without the explicit, prior written consent of the trust manager, the entire remaining principal balance of the loan became immediately due and payable in full. The grace period was 0 days. My father had spent his entire life assessing people by what he could extract from them. He viewed my independence not as an achievement, but as an untapped reservoir of equity. But his fatal flaw was his sheer, blinding arrogance. When he looked at my house, he only saw a financial lifeline ready to be harvested. It never once crossed his mind to ask how a young single woman with an entry-level salary had managed to secure a prime piece of real estate in a competitive neighborhood. He just assumed I had scraped the cash together, and therefore, it was his for the taking. He never ran a simple background check. He never ordered a preliminary title search. He assumed the only real hurdle was breaking my emotional will. My phone buzzed on my desk at Larkstone. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The caller ID flashed my brother's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water, before I swiped the screen and answered. "You set us up," Brett hissed into the receiver. His voice was not the booming, confident tone of a visionary founder holding court on his patio. It was the frantic, high-pitched squeal of a man who had just stepped on a landmine. "You knew about this. You signed the deed knowing this lien was sitting right there." I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair and looked out the window at the city skyline. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Brett. I simply gave you exactly what Dad demanded. The deed to the property. The June Ellison Trust," he shouted, the panic fully overtaking his vocal cords. "Hawthorne Bridge just kicked the entire loan file back. They are demanding a payoff statement. You owe $85,000 on this house. Rachel." The trust was triggered the second the county clerk recorded my name on the title. "They want the money right now." I kept my voice absolutely flat, cold, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "I do not owe the trust anything, Brett. You do. You are the legal owner of the property now. The debt is secured by the house. If the house transferred to you, the lien transferred with it. I did not hide the debt. You all just never cared to look at what you were taking. You are insane," he stammered, breathing heavily into the microphone. "Dad is going to lose his mind when I tell him. Dad is the one who brought the notary," I reminded him softly. "Have a wonderful afternoon, Brett." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on my desk. The fallout on their end was instantaneous and brutal. Hawthorne Bridge Lending did not deal in messy family disputes or complicated title defects. They were in the business of secure, high-interest, fast capital. The moment their underwriters saw the private lien and the triggered acceleration clause, they slammed the brakes on the entire transaction. They sent Brett a formal, legally binding notice stating that the loan application was indefinitely suspended. They would not authorize a single dollar of funding until the June Ellison Family Trust was satisfied in full, and a clean release of lien was recorded with the county. Martin, in a state of absolute desperation, instructed Brett to call the trust manager and beg for a waiver. My father, operating on a lifetime of unearned confidence, assumed he could sweet-talk his way out of it. He thought he could treat a legally binding fiduciary trust like a petty neighborhood dispute over a property line. He was drastically wrong. Harold, the trustee, did not care about Martin's excuses or Brett's supposedly brilliant business plans. Harold cared exclusively about his fiduciary duty to preserve the assets of the trust. Furthermore, Harold had a thick file on his desk containing printed screenshots of Brett's public social media pages. Brett had proudly and publicly declared he was using the residential property to launch a commercial design studio. He had announced his intention to alter the structural integrity of the asset to impress investors. The trust manager explicitly cited those exact social media posts during their phone call. Harold declared them a gross violation of the original residential loan terms. He informed Brett that the trust would never subordinate its senior position to a high-risk commercial lender, nor would it grant a waiver to someone who was clearly attempting to leverage the property for speculative, unfunded business purposes. The denial was absolute and final. The $85,000 was due immediately, or the trust would initiate foreclosure proceedings against Brett to reclaim the property. The sheer force of the blow shattered the festive, victorious atmosphere in my family. The smug satisfaction vanished overnight, replaced by a suffocating, icy panic. It was my mother who cracked first. Helena had spent the last 2 weeks playing the role of the benevolent matriarch, decorating the house with expensive fabrics and praising my supposed generosity to anyone who would listen. But Helena was not stupid when it came to self-preservation. When Martin came home that evening and furiously explained that they were suddenly on the hook for a massive, immediate cash payout, just to keep the house from being repossessed by a dead relative's trust, the narrative of my beautiful sacrifice completely dissolved. "Why did we have to do this so fast?" Helena demanded, her voice rising in their kitchen. A conversation my aunt eagerly and vividly relayed to me days later. "Why did you force her to sign on a Tuesday morning without having a lawyer look at the title? You said Brett just needed a place to live. You never said you were making him take out a commercial bridge loan. Why do we need this money right now?" Martin tried to shout her down, falling back on his usual bluster about complicated corporate finances and necessary business risks, but Helena was genuinely terrified. She was looking at her husband and realizing that he had driven them all off a cliff blindfolded. She stopped talking about how family was more important than property. Instead, she started asking the dangerous, probing questions she had avoided her entire marriage. She wanted to know why Martin was so obsessed with securing the Hawthorne Bridge money so quickly. This shock did not completely destroy the Wakefield family in one afternoon. They still had their pride, and Martin still had his stubborn refusal to admit defeat. But it was the first, deep, structural crack in their foundation. It shattered the thick layer of paint they had used to cover up their toxic dynamic and their financial mismanagement. They had tried to steal my stability to fund their delusions, and instead, they had chained themselves to a ticking time bomb. While my family was suffocating under the sudden, crushing weight of the June Ellison family trust lien, running frantically from phone call to phone call, trying to find a loophole that did not exist, I was sitting in the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of Lena Voss's conference room. The panicked chaos consuming the bungalow felt a million miles away. We were not looking at the current disaster. We were looking backward, digging into the foundation of the lies. For 2 weeks, Lena had been aggressively pursuing the origin of that strange credit inquiry from 6 months prior. She had bypassed the automated consumer dispute portals and gone directly to the legal department of the junk debt purchasing firm that currently held the dormant file. Using a combination of aggressive legal posturing and the threat of a massive fair credit reporting lawsuit, Lena had forced them to release the entire original origination package. Now, the physical evidence of my family's betrayal was spread across the polished mahogany table. Lena slid a heavy, staple-bound stack of paper toward me. It was a commercial equipment lease from 5 years ago. It detailed the rental of industrial mowers, flatbed trailers, and aerators for Brett's defunct landscaping limited liability company. I flipped past the itemized lists and the standard corporate boilerplate language until I reached the final page, the guarantor signature page. I stared at the ink. The name printed on the line was Rachel Wakefield. I traced the loops of the signature with my index finger. It was an incredibly deliberate, practiced attempt to mimic my handwriting. The slant was slightly too aggressive. The crossing of the letter T was too heavy. But to a careless underwriter rushing to meet a monthly quota, it looked legitimate. What chilled me was not just the forged name, but the data supporting it. The application listed my social security number, my exact date of birth, and my address from 5 years ago, a terrible, drafty apartment on Elm Street. It listed my gross annual income from that specific year with terrifying accuracy. Whoever filled out this form did not just guess my details. They had full, unhindered access to my tax returns and my private banking information. Brett is arrogant and entirely careless, Lena said, leaning back in her leather chair and watching my face closely. He leaves a trail of messy mistakes everywhere he goes. This document is too clean. The data points match your historical credit profile perfectly. Your brother did not orchestrate this. My father did, I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the large room. I pulled the correspondence logs attached to the vendor file. Lena continued, opening a separate manila folder. When Brett's company first missed a payment 4 years ago, the original leasing agent sent a default warning. Look at the response. She handed me a printed copy of an email. The sender address belonged to Martin Wakefield. The email was a masterclass in corporate stalling. My father had written to the vendor, assuring them that the missed payment was merely a cash flow hiccup due to seasonal weather delays. But it was the final sentence that made my stomach turn into a block of ice. My father had typed, "If the boy falls behind again next quarter, we can pivot the outstanding balance to Rachel's assets. She is solid. She will serve as the necessary collateral when needed. Do not accelerate the debt. When needed." I read those 2 words over and over again. They were not words of parental pride. They were the words of a rancher assessing a prime piece of livestock. For my entire adult life, I believed my parents simply favored my brother because he was charming and needy. I thought my role as the strong, independent daughter was just a convenient excuse for them to ignore me. Sitting in that conference room, the truth finally snapped into focus. My independence was not ignored. It was actively cultivated. They did not leave me alone because they trusted me to succeed. They left me alone so I could build a pristine credit score, accumulate equity, and establish a flawless financial record. All so I could serve as a secure, untouched reserve fund for their endless mistakes. The forced transfer of my house was not a sudden, desperate idea to help Brett launch a design studio. It was the natural culmination of a decade-long strategy. I was their designated financial buffer, and they had finally decided it was time to cash me in. My phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table, shattering the heavy silence. It was Brett. I let it vibrate for 10 seconds, taking a slow, deep breath to bury the burning rage deep inside my chest. I needed to be entirely devoid of emotion. I needed to be a mirror. I tapped the screen and answered the call. "Rachel, you have to fix this," Brett practically screamed into the phone. The confident, visionary tone he had paraded around the house for the last 3 weeks was completely gone. He sounded like a terrified child who had just broken a neighbor's window. "Hawthorne Bridge just sent a formal rejection letter. They officially killed the bridge loan. Dad is losing his absolute mind. I cannot fix a legally binding trust document." "Brett," I said calmly, "the lien is recorded. You own the house, which means you owe the trust $85,000. That is how property law works." "You do not understand," Brett pleaded, his voice cracking. The background noise sounded like he was pacing rapidly across the hardwood floors of my former living room. "Dad is screaming at Mom. He is throwing things in the garage. He told me the Hawthorne money had to be wired by Friday. He said the title had to be clean in my name before the end of the month, so he could go talk about money. If he does not get the capital, he is ruined." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He said the title had to be clean in my name before the end of the month so he could go talk about money. I squeezed my eyes shut, processing the grammatical structure of my brother's panic. He, not we, not Brett. Martin needed to go talk about money. "Brett," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, "why does Dad need to talk about money?" "The bridge loan was for your design studio. You are the one who needed the capital to renovate the bungalow." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Brett's ragged breathing. He was entirely out of his depth. He had been handed a script by our father, but the script had caught fire, and Brett had no idea how to improvise. The studio was real, Brett stammered defensively, though the conviction was entirely missing from his voice. But the Hawthorne loan was too big just for renovations. Dad structured it. He said if I took out a maximum equity bridge loan, I could use 20% for the studio, and he would take the other 80% to patch a hole in his commercial real estate portfolio. He said he would pay me back by next year. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. Locking the entire picture together, Martin was the one bleeding out. Brett was nothing but a convenient, disposable mask. My father knew he could never convince me to sign over my house to save his failing commercial investments. I would have demanded spreadsheets, risk assessments, and legal guarantees. But he knew my ingrained, lifelong habit of yielding to my brother's needs. He weaponized Brett's endless failures to create a false emergency, using my mother's tears and my brother's supposed redemption as the ultimate smokescreen. Dad is the one who needs the money, I repeated softly, making sure the words were spoken aloud. Yes, Brett whispered miserably. And now the Hawthorne underwriter flagged the trust lien, and Dad cannot get the cash, and he is blaming me for not checking the title history. He is blaming you for taking the exact asset he handed you, I noted dryly. Rachel, please, Brett begged. Just call the trust manager. Tell them it is a family misunderstanding. Tell them to lift the lien for 30 days. Just 30 days. Once Dad gets the Hawthorne money, he can figure something else out. I looked across the table at Lena. She was watching me intently, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. She had heard enough of the muffled shouting through the phone speaker to understand the dynamic had just shifted permanently. If I wanted to, I could have exploded right then and there. I could have screamed at Brett about the forged equipment lease from 5 years ago. I could have told him that our father had been using my identity as a shadow guarantor for years. I could have burned the entire relationship to the ground in a fiery, satisfying moment of righteous anger. But anger is cheap. Anger fades. Evidence is forever. I did not want to just escape this family. I wanted to dismantle the entire fraudulent narrative they had built around my life. I needed Martin to sit in a room and admit, under legally binding circumstances, exactly what he had done. I needed my mother to hear it. I needed Brett to realize he was just as expendable as I was, only in a different way. I cannot call the trust. Brett, I said, my voice dropping to a sympathetic, quiet register. It was the exact tone my mother used when she was delivering bad news. The trustee will not speak to me. You are the legal owner now. The only way out of this is for everyone to sit down and untangle the paperwork together. Tell Mom and Dad we need to meet. Meet where? Brett asked nervously. I will let you know, I replied. I hung up the phone. The conference room was completely silent again. I looked down at the forged signature on the equipment lease. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a wild, uncontrollable fire. It was a cold, focused laser. He is using Brett as a straw borrower to bail out his own sinking portfolio, I told Lena, tapping my finger against the fraudulent document. The house was never for Brett. It was a money laundering vehicle for my father. Lena set her pen down and folded her hands together. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. So, we are no longer just fighting a coerced property transfer. No, I said, standing up from the heavy leather chair. We are pulling the entire house of cards down. Draft the demand letters. Lena. It is time to make them speak on the record. My mother called on a Thursday evening, her voice trembling with that specific, engineered fragility she used whenever she needed a favor she had no right to ask for. She pleaded for a private family talk. She claimed everything had simply gotten out of hand, a terrible miscommunication, and that if I just came down and signed a few waivers for the trust, we could put this entire ugly chapter behind us. She suggested the side chapel at Grace Fellowship, the church our family had attended since I was 7 years old. It was a calculated choice of venue. It was supposed to make me feel small, guilty, and obligated to forgive. I agreed to meet at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, but I did not walk into that chapel as the obedient, sacrificial daughter. I walked through the heavy oak doors flanked by two people who actually protected my interests. Noah walked on my right, his presence steady and imposing. Lena Voss walked on my left, wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked significantly more threatening than a Bible. When my parents and Brett saw the three of us walking down the narrow aisle of the empty side chapel, the manufactured warmth drained instantly from my mother's face. Martin stood up from the front pew, his jaw clenching. He had expected a weeping, apologetic girl. He got an ambush. "What is this? Rachel?" Martin demanded, his voice echoing off the stained glass windows. "Your mother specifically asked for a private family meeting. Who is this woman?" "This is my legal counsel, Lena Voss," I said, sliding into a pew across the aisle from them. Noah sat beside me. Lena remained standing, perfectly balanced in her heels. "And considering you brought a notary to my house on a Tuesday morning without warning, I figured bringing a lawyer to a church was a fair compromise." Helena wrung her hands. "Rachel, sweetheart, please. Do not make this a legal thing. We are family. We just need to fix this little hurdle with Aunt June's trust, so Brett does not lose his chance to start over." Martin took the cue, smoothly shifting into the role of the wounded patriarch. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wooden pew in front of him. "You are blowing a simple misunderstanding completely out of proportion. We just want to help your brother get on his feet. If you do not soften up and sign a temporary waiver for the trust, Brett is going to lose his new investors. You are going to ruin his chance at a real life over a petty grudge." It was the same script they had used my entire life. Guilt, obligation, the myth of saving Brett. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my smartphone, and placed it on the flat wooden surface of the pew. "Noah," I said softly, looking at my husband, "you had your phone resting on the kitchen counter the morning they came to take the house, right?" Noah nodded, his expression completely blank. "I hit record the second they walked through the front door. I know how your father operates." Martin's face went rigid. Brett frowned, looking deeply confused. I tapped the screen. The acoustics of the quiet chapel amplified the playback perfectly. The recording captured the tense, cold atmosphere of my former kitchen. It played my own voice asking if they would stop using my life to fix Brett's mistakes. It played Martin's quick, greedy agreement. But then, right as the sound of paper shuffling indicated I was signing the pages, the microphone picked up a hushed, impatient whisper from Martin directed squarely at Brett. "Just stand there and look grateful." The recorded voice of my father hissed, "I need this title clean enough for the short-term lender by Friday, or we are completely underwater." I tapped the screen again, stopping the playback. The chapel was so quiet, I could hear the distant hum of the traffic outside. Brett slowly turned his head to look at our father. For the first time in his 29 years of life, the golden child was looking at the man who had always bailed him out, and he was not seeing a savior. He was seeing a puppeteer. "Clean enough for the preterm lender," Brett repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "You told me the bridge loan was for the studio. You told me we had to use the house to get the capital to fix my credit and launch the business." Martin opened his mouth, but Lena Voss did not give him a single second to spin a lie. She stepped forward, resting her hands on the back of the pew. "Let us bypass the family drama and discuss the legal reality," Lena said, her voice cutting through the air like a surgical scalpel. "What we have here is a documented case of coerced property transfer under false pretenses. Furthermore, my firm has spent the last 2 weeks tracing a fraudulent equipment lease from 5 years ago. A lease containing my client's forged signature and misappropriated personal data, strategically used to secure commercial landscaping equipment for Brett, but entirely orchestrated by someone with full access to Rachel's long-term financial history." Helena let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth. Lena ignored her and kept her eyes locked on Martin. If we go to civil court, we will not just be unwinding a deed transfer, we will be opening a multi-year investigation into identity theft, wire fraud, and the gross misrepresentation of loan purposes to a commercial lender. You are not trying to help your son, Mr. Wakefield. You are using him to launder your own financial negligence. That is a lie, Martin barked, but his face was ashen. The booming authority in his voice had completely cracked. Then let us do formal discovery, Lena challenged immediately, her tone lethal and calm. Let us subpoena your entire commercial real estate portfolio right now. Stop, Helena cried out. Her voice broke completely, shattering the carefully maintained illusion she had worn for 40 years. Tears spilled over her cheeks, ruining her makeup. She looked at Brett, then at me, and finally at her husband. Martin, stop it. Just stop lying. I cannot do this anymore. Helena, keep your mouth shut, Martin snapped, genuine panic finally bleeding into his eyes. But my mother was entirely unraveled. The threat of a public, criminal investigation had broken her spirit. He is stuck, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. The warehouse investment out on County Road 9. It failed 2 years ago. The development partners pulled out. Martin has been secretly pouring our retirement money into it, trying to keep it afloat. He took out terrible private loans. And then Brett got into that awful debt with the supply vendors last year. And Martin used the last of our liquid cash to pay them off, so Brett would not go to jail. We have nothing left. He needed the house to get the bridge loan to save the warehouse. The truth hung in the chapel air. Ugly, desperate, and undeniable. Brett stood up. He looked physically ill. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not the beloved son being protected from his own mistakes. He was just a convenient, disposable frontman. He was a human shield for debt. You used me, Brett said, his voice shaking. He looked at Martin with absolute disgust. You made me think I was finally doing something right with the design studio. You let me brag to everyone in town. And you were just setting me up to hold the bag for your failed warehouse. I was trying to save this family, Martin shouted, standing up to face his son, desperate to regain control. I have carried all of you for decades. You did not carry anyone, I said, my voice cold and unyielding. I stood up, looking at the man who had stolen my identity and tried to steal my home. You used us as sandbags to stop your own sinking ship. Brett did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum. For the very first time in his entire life, he simply turned his back on our parents. He walked down the center aisle of the church, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the stone floor. He pushed the heavy oak doors open and walked out into the evening air, leaving Martin and Helena completely alone in their ruin. The meeting was over. There was no reconciliation. There were no waivers signed. The grand, noble story of a family sacrificing everything to help a troubled son had burned to the ground, leaving nothing but ashes in the cold. Hard reality of impending legal consequences. I looked at my mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably in the pew, and my father, who was staring blankly at the doors Brett had just walked through. Have your lawyer call my lawyer on Monday morning, I told Martin. Noah placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me gently out of the pew. We walked out of the chapel together, stepping out into the cool air, leaving the wreckage exactly where it belonged, exposed and cornered in the quiet nave of that church. My father did what cornered men of his generation always do. He immediately changed the battlefield. If he could not win on legal grounds or financial leverage, he would win in the ruthless court of public opinion. By Monday morning, a carefully orchestrated, highly toxic smear campaign was sweeping through our extended family network and the tight-knit local church congregation. Martin was calling my aunts, my uncles, and his influential golfing buddies, painting a tragic, tearful portrait of a devoted patriarch betrayed by his own flesh and blood. According to his new, completely fabricated narrative, I was not a victim of financial coercion or identity theft. I was a greedy, vindictive daughter who had decided to stab her own family in the back for a massive cash payout. He claimed I was intentionally using a minor, forgotten legal technicality within Aunt June's trust to extort my elderly parents and bankrupt my struggling brother over a petty misunderstanding about a wedding gift. The psychological pain of this tactic was entirely different from the pain of losing the physical property. The house was ultimately just wood, glass, and mortar. But my personal history was my identity. Having people who had known me since I was 7 years old suddenly look at me with pity or outright disgust in the aisles of the local grocery store was suffocating. I received passive-aggressive text messages from cousins telling me I needed to find Jesus and forgive my family. My aunt hung up the phone the second she heard my voice. I was facing the agonizing realization that my father was successfully rewriting the entire story of my life, twisting my decades of quiet obedience and financial independence into a villainous origin story. I paced the narrow floor of our rented carriage house for hours, my phone gripped tightly in my hand, ready to draft a massive public statement on social media to defend myself. I wanted to post the audio recording. I wanted to scream the truth at anyone who would listen. Noah stepped in front of me, his large hands gently but firmly taking the phone from my fingers. He did not offer toxic, fiery encouragement to burn my family to the ground. He offered something infinitely more valuable in a crisis: structural integrity. "Do not fight them in the mud," Noah told me, his voice a low, calming anchor in the storm of my anxiety. "If you try to explain yourself to people who actively want to believe a lie, you just look guilty and desperate. Let the paperwork do the talking. We stick strictly to the evidence. We stick to the procedure. That is the only foundation that will not sink when the tide comes in." I listened to my husband. I did not make a single phone call to defend myself. I did not send a single retaliatory text message. Instead, I let Lena Voss drop a legal anvil on their heads. By Wednesday afternoon, Lena officially filed a massive civil lawsuit in the county courthouse. It was a brutal, comprehensive, and entirely unfeeling document that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or emotional manipulation. We formally demanded the immediate nullification of the coerced deed transfer based on fraudulent inducement. We petitioned the court for a full forensic investigation into the validity of the 5-year-old commercial equipment guarantees bearing my forged signature. Finally, we demanded complete financial restitution for all legal fees, punitive damages for the intentional destruction of my credit profile, and the immediate reinstatement of the title into my name. We did not serve them quietly through the mail. Lena instructed the process server to deliver the heavy stack of legal summons directly to Martin while he was sitting at his country club during his weekly networking lunch. The public humiliation was precise and calculated. Meanwhile, Brett was trapped in a miserable, dust-filled purgatory of his own making. He was physically living inside my bungalow, which he had eagerly and arrogantly begun to demolish the week before. The custom kitchen cabinets I had saved for were ripped off the walls. The expensive hardwood flooring was torn up in the living room to expose the subfloor. Everything was covered in a thick, choking layer of white drywall dust. But without the massive Hawthorne Bridge loan, he could not afford to buy a single piece of new material, let alone hire a professional contractor to put the rooms back together. Brett was sleeping on a cheap air mattress in the middle of a destroyed construction zone. He could not secure a secondary line of credit because the triggered trust lien was a massive red flag to any legitimate bank. He did not dare abandon the property because leaving would mean admitting total defeat. But he no longer believed a single word our father said. He was stranded on an island of debris, finally realizing he was nothing more than an unpaid, discarded pawn in a game he did not even understand. The final fatal blow to Martin's public relations campaign arrived 3 days after we filed the lawsuit. As part of the preliminary legal discovery process, Lena aggressively subpoenaed the internal underwriting communications from Hawthorne Bridge Lending. They complied, sending over a sworn correspondence record. It was a formal confirmation letter sent by their chief commercial underwriter. The document explicitly stated that the private lender had been provided with financial projections indicating the property would be used as a hard asset to secure capital for a commercial debt restructuring initiative. The funds were earmarked to save a failing warehouse investment under Martin's corporate umbrella. The phrase design studio did not appear anywhere in the 50-page underwriting file. This single piece of paper was a lethal weapon. It completely obliterated the version of events Martin had sold to our extended family. He had sworn to his brothers, his sisters, and his church congregation that everything he did was purely out of a desperate, loving desire to give Brett a fresh start in the design business. The Hawthorne letter proved, in stark black and white ink, that Martin had fully intended to sacrifice both of his children simply to save his own sinking commercial real estate portfolio. Lena made absolutely sure a copy of that letter was entered into the public court record, where any curious relative or local gossip could easily find it. The whispers in our town immediately changed direction. The sympathetic phone calls to my father stopped entirely. As the walls of undeniable proof closed in, the immense social and legal pressure began to completely crush my mother. The silent, enabling complicity she had carefully maintained for 40 years finally fractured under the weight of an impending trial. My phone started ringing at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was always Helena. She would cry softly into the receiver, the sound thick with cheap white wine and absolute desperation. "Please, sweetheart," she sobbed during one call on a rainy Tuesday night. "Do not push your dad too far over the edge. He is at his breaking point. We are going to lose absolutely everything we have. I know he made terrible mistakes with the warehouse investment, but he was just trying to provide a legacy for us. Please, just call your lawyer and drop the lawsuit. I am begging you." With every tearful, late-night confession, my mother inadvertently dug their grave deeper. She was admitting that she had known about the financial ruin long before the Tuesday morning they showed up on my porch with the notary public. She had known about the failing warehouse. She had known about the crushing debt. She had known exactly why my father was demanding my house, and she had smiled, brought me a box of lemon pastries, and watched him lead me to the slaughter anyway. The more my parents tried to plug the holes in their sinking ship, the more my former home acted as a giant, unavoidable megaphone. The house was broadcasting every toxic, hidden secret they had successfully buried over the last 20 years. The pressure on our family was no longer just a matter of legal disputes or property rights. It was a complete, undeniable, and terminal collapse of their entire reality. The text message arrived on my phone at exactly 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. It was from Brett. He did not use his usual demanding tone, nor did he try to spin a false narrative about family unity. The message was brief, entirely stripped of his unearned arrogance. He asked if we could meet in person, privately, away from our parents. He suggested a rundown, 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of Fairwick. When I pulled into the empty parking lot the following morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. I walked into the diner and found my brother sitting in the furthest corner booth. He looked terrible. The confident, visionary entrepreneur who had proudly posed on my front porch just weeks ago was completely gone. In his place sat a hollowed-out, exhausted man staring blankly at a mug of black coffee. He looked exactly like someone who had just realized he was standing on a floor completely eaten through by rot. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Brett reached down to the floor and hoisted a heavy, battered cardboard banker's box onto the table. It landed with a solid thud, rattling the silverware. "I drove over to Dad's house last night while he and Mom were at their evening church service," Brett said, his voice barely above a hoarse whisper. "I broke the padlock off the storage cabinet in the back of the garage. The one he always told us just held old tax returns." He pushed the box toward me. I pulled the lid off. The box was a graveyard of financial sins. I began pulling out thick stacks of paper. There were bank statements detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars hemorrhaging from our father's accounts to cover the failing warehouse project. There were severe, final warning letters from commercial collection agencies. But the most horrifying documents were nestled in a separate, red folder near the bottom. I opened it and found a dozen more guarantor applications and short-term credit agreements. They dated back over the last 7 years. Every single one of them bore my forged signature, my social security number, and my historical addresses. My father had not just used my identity once for the landscaping equipment. He had been using my clean financial profile as his own personal shadow bank for nearly a decade. "Keep digging," Brett instructed quietly, watching my eyes scan the fraudulent ink. "Look at the manila envelope." I found the envelope, unclasped the metal tab, and pulled out a few pages of printed emails. They were internal communications between Martin and a sleazy, high-risk debt restructuring consultant. The emails were dated 2 months prior to the morning they showed up at my house with the notary. I read the words my father had typed. The memo explicitly outlined Martin's absolute, undeniable intention for my property. He wrote that he needed to coerce me into transferring the asset into a highly manipulatable name, specifically Brett's name. The consultant had advised him that my brother's desperate need for validation made him the perfect straw buyer. Martin never intended for Brett to live in the bungalow. He never intended for Brett to launch a design studio. The strategy was entirely predatory. Martin planned to use Brett's clean title to secure the maximum possible commercial bridge loan, drain 100% of the cash equity to patch the holes in his warehouse investment, and then simply abandon the property. He was planning to let Hawthorne Bridge Lending foreclose on my house, leaving Brett entirely responsible for the massive default. "He was going to let me take the fall," Brett whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, shattering grief. "He was going to bleed the house dry, take the cash, and leave me holding a commercial foreclosure on my record." I thought he was finally proud of me. I thought he was finally treating me like a real business partner. But he was just setting me up as the fall guy. Brett finally understood his actual place in the Wakefield family hierarchy. He was the pampered, coddled golden child only when it was cheap and convenient. When genuine financial ruin threatened our father, Brett was instantly repurposed into a human shield, shoved blindly into the line of fire to absorb the fatal impact. He looked across the table at me, his eyes wide and pleading, waiting for me to offer sympathy. He expected me to reach across the table, hold his hand, and tell him we would get through this together. I did not move a single muscle. Reading those emails did not soften my heart. The revelation did not make me pity my brother. It simply crystallized the cold, hard fury in my chest. For 37 years, my parents had praised my strength and my independence. They told me I was the rock of the family. Sitting in that diner, I realized being the strong one was never a compliment. It was a strategic designation. It just meant I was their designated backup asset, a fully funded emergency account they kept on a shelf until they needed to liquidate me. "I am sorry, Rachel," Brett choked out, burying his face in his hands. "I am so sorry I took the keys. Apologies do not clear a clouded title." "Brett," I said smoothly, pulling the documents back into a neat stack and placing them inside the cardboard box. "But your testimony will." I recognized immediately that this box was the kill shot. Martin had spent the last week desperately trying to maintain a fragile balance of power, relying on the assumption that Brett would stay loyal to the family narrative. Brett flipping sides, armed with a box of original, forged documents, and written proof of a premeditated financial crime, completely obliterated our father's defense. I carried the box out to my car and drove directly to the city, walking straight into Lena Voss's office. Lena spent the next 48 hours forensically categorizing every single piece of paper Brett had stolen. We used the documents to prepare for the mandatory judicial mediation session scheduled for the end of the month. In our state, civil disputes of this nature required a formal mediation attempt before a judge would grant a trial date. Lena used the new evidence to completely weaponize our position. She tightened the legal noose until there was no room left to breathe. Our demands were no longer just a request to reverse the deed. Lena drafted a binding resolution requiring Martin and Helena to return the house free and clear of all new encumbrances. They were required to immediately liquidate their own remaining assets to pay off the $85,000 trust mortgage they had recklessly triggered. They had to reimburse every single cent of my legal fees, and they had to sign a sworn affidavit admitting to the identity theft, which we would use to permanently clean my credit profile. Sensing the devastating shift in our leverage, Martin's legal counsel panicked. On a Thursday morning, they sent over a desperate, utterly pathetic settlement offer. My father proposed a half-hearted compromise. He offered to let Brett keep the house, but promised that he and my mother would slowly pay me back the original equity of the property in small, unsecured monthly installments over the next 15 years. In exchange for this hollow promise, I had to immediately drop the civil lawsuit, withdraw the fraud allegations, and sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding his business practices. It was the ultimate insult, even staring down the barrel of total ruin. My father still believed he could negotiate his way out of a corner by offering me a bad deal wrapped in family duty. Lena read the proposal aloud in her office. When she finished, she looked up at me over the rim of her glasses. For the very first time since my parents stepped onto my porch with that notary, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp, entirely merciless expression. "Tell them no," I instructed my lawyer, leaning back in my chair. "Tell them we reject every single term." The days of negotiating my worth in the middle of a kitchen were over. I was done arguing with ghosts and gaslighters. The final collision was no longer avoidable. It was going to happen in a sterile conference room, where legally binding documents, sworn testimony, hard currency, and absolute power would smash into each other, and my family would finally have absolutely nowhere left to hide. The mandatory judicial mediation took place at 9 o'clock in the morning inside a windowless, aggressively air-conditioned conference room on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Martin walked in wearing a tailored navy suit. He carried himself with the stiff, practiced posture of a man who genuinely believed he could still charm his way out of a burning building. He smiled at the court-appointed mediator, a retired judge with tired eyes, and took his seat at the long mahogany table as if he were about to lead a quarterly sales meeting. I sat directly across from him. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer the emotional breakdown my father was banking on to make me look like an unstable, vindictive child. Instead, I operated with the lethal precision of a contract manager. One by one, I placed the physical pieces of my father's destruction onto the polished surface of the table. First, I laid down the pristine, notarized copy of the deed transfer from that Tuesday morning. Next to it, I placed my phone, hitting play on the audio recording where Martin explicitly demanded the title be made clean enough for the preterm lender. Then came the formal rejection letter from Hawthorne Bridge Lending, citing the commercial debt restructuring. Finally, I placed the thick bound copy of the June Ellison Family Trust mortgage terms directly in the center. Martin's lawyer, a sweaty man who had clearly not been given the full story by his client, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. But the air in the room did not turn completely toxic until Lena Voss opened the battered cardboard box Brett had surrendered. She pulled out the forged commercial equipment guarantees and slid them across the table. Following the forged signatures, Lena presented the printed emails where Martin referred to my financial stability as his personal rescue fund. "This is an orchestrated, multi-year pattern of financial abuse and identity theft," Lena stated, her voice as hard as concrete. "Mr. Wakefield did not coerce my client into signing away her home to help his son. He weaponized his son to steal my client's equity to save his own failing commercial warehouse investments." My mother, sitting beside Martin, let out a distressed whimper. Helena instinctively tried to protect her husband, a reflex honed over 4 decades. "That is not true," Helena cried out, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. "Martin was just trying to keep everything afloat for all of us. You do not understand the pressure he was under. Rachel, please tell them about how we were just trying to help Brett." Lena did not miss a beat. She pulled a printed transcript of text messages and voicemails from her file. "Mrs. Wakefield," Lena said coldly, "are you referring to the voicemails you left my client at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, begging her not to push her father over the edge because you both knew the warehouse investment had failed 2 years ago? Your own desperate pleas for leniency Confirm that you were fully aware of the true, fraudulent motive behind the property transfer before the notary ever set foot on the porch. Helena covered her mouth, realizing instantly that her late-night attempts at emotional manipulation had just driven the final nail into her husband's legal coffin. Then, it was Brett's turn. My brother sat at the far end of the table, as far away from our parents as the room would allow, when the mediator asked him to clarify his role. Brett did not hesitate. He looked directly at the retired judge and systematically dismantled our father's grand lie. My dad told me to play the part of the desperate son who needed a place to live and a clean address to start a design studio. Brett testified, his voice devoid of any of its former arrogance. But he told me behind closed doors that the real plan was to use my name on the title to secure a massive commercial loan. He needed the money to patch a massive hole in a failed real estate deal. He never intended for me to keep the house. He was just going to drain the equity and let the lender foreclose on me. The silence that followed was absolute. Martin stared at his son, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. The arrogant patriarch, who had controlled our family narrative for my entire life, was entirely out of ammunition. There was no one left to blame. There was no one left to gaslight. The mediator looked at Martin's lawyer, who simply closed his legal pad and shook his head. Faced with the undeniable threat of a massive civil fraud trial and the very real possibility of criminal charges for identity theft, Martin finally broke. He slumped in his chair, staring at the polished wood of the table, and quietly admitted it all. He confessed that Brett was never supposed to rebuild his life in that bungalow. He confessed that he only needed the property transferred into a compliant name fast enough and clean enough to rotate his failing capital. The settlement was drafted and signed before we ever left the courthouse. Brett signed a quitclaim deed, immediately transferring the property title completely back into my name. But the financial bleeding for my parents had only just begun. To satisfy the accelerated $85,000 mortgage triggered by Aunt June's trust, pay my extensive legal fees, and cover the forensic accounting costs required to repair my credit profile, Martin and Helena were forced to liquidate their remaining assets. They had to immediately list their beloved lakeside cabin for sale and surrender their remaining equity shares in the failed warehouse project. They walked out of that mediation room financially decimated and publicly exposed. But the greatest victory was not simply taking the house back. It was what I chose to do with it next. I never moved back into the bungalow. That property, despite all the blood and sweat I had poured into it, was permanently tainted by the memory of my family walking through the front door like vultures. It was no longer a sanctuary. So, the very day the title cleared, I listed it on the open market. Because of the aggressive renovations Brett had started and the prime location, it sold in less than 2 weeks for a beautiful, substantial profit. Noah and I took that money and bought a completely different house in Fairwick. It was a sturdy, older home with a wraparound porch and ancient oak trees in the backyard. It was a place my parents had never stepped foot in. It was a place where absolutely no memories were contaminated by their greed. The last time I spoke to my father was in the parking lot of the courthouse after the mediation concluded. The humid afternoon air pressed down on us. Martin looked old, defeated, and profoundly bitter. He stopped me before I could reach Noah's truck. "Are you happy now, Rachel?" Martin asked, his voice dripping with resentment. "You broke your mother's heart. You ruined your brother. You took everything. Is it enough?" I looked at the man who had secretly used my name to fund his mistakes. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the fiery, toxic rush of a vindictive revenge. I just felt incredibly, wonderfully light. "This was never about whether it was enough, Dad," I replied, my voice completely serene. "This is simply the first time in my entire life that I get to decide what actually belongs to me." I turned my back on him, opened the door to the truck, and left him standing there in the heat. I did not walk away as a cruel avenger. I walked away as a woman who had finally, permanently, stopped letting herself be used as the foundation for other people's failures. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.